The bell above the meeting hall door had not rung so loud in years, and when it did, on that white-hot afternoon in the summer of 1934, every soul in the valley of Cedar Hollow turned to see who would walk through it, because they all knew that the water they needed to survive belonged now to a woman. Most of them had spent 2 seasons laughing at. The heat pressed down on the town of Merrill's Bend like a hand upon a fevered brow, and the dust that came in through the open window settled gray on the shoulders of men who had once been prosperous and were now merely afraid. They had gathered to beg, that was the plain truth of it. Though they dressed it in the language of a meeting and a proposal and a fair arrangement. And at the front of the room, seated in a straight-back chair, with her calloused hands folded in her lap and her chin level, was Nell Ashby, 31 years old, a woman alone, who had come to that valley with almost nothing and had bought a ruin and a flock of dying animals for the price of a good meal. She held the whole of Cedar Hollow's future in her keeping now, and the room waited for her to speak, and she said nothing yet, and let them wait. Understand this before you understand anything else. The verdict on Nell Ashby had already been passed, and not by these frightened men. It had been passed long before, by the land itself in a language they had all forgotten how to read. Wind now, 2 summers back, to a morning in the spring of 1932, when Nell Ashby stepped down off the mail wagon at the edge of Merrill's Bend with a single carpetbag, a cedar trunk that a hired boy set grumbling in the dust, and $41 folded flat in the toe of her boot. She was a widow, though the word felt too grand for a marriage of 11 months to a railroad man who had died under a coupling car and left her a small settlement and the freedom to spend it foolishly. She had no people in that country. She had answered a notice in a farm paper about a parcel going cheap in the high dry benchlands above the hollow. 90 acres of thin soil and a collapsing house and a barn with half its roof gone to the weather, and she had bought it sight unseen for $32 because that was what a place nobody wanted cost in a year when nobody had money. The men in the land office had taken her signature with the careful neutrality of men who expect a fool to come back weeping inside a season. She did not weep. She rode out to the place in a borrowed cart and walked its boundaries and did the arithmetic of it. 90 acres. A house needing more than she could ever put into it. A barn she could patch with her own 2 hands if the summer held. And when the man who sold her the land mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there was a flock of sheep on the far parcel that the previous owner had abandoned when he went bust and rode east, 65 head of them starving on picked-over ground, she said she would take a look. They were a pitiful sight, those 65 sheep. They were a scrub flock, mongrel things, not the fine-wooled animals the big outfits down in the bottomland ran, but a coarse hardy breed gone, half-feral. Their fleeces, matted with burrs and their ribs showing like the staves of empty barrels. The county had a lien on them for back grazing fees, and the sheriff was to sell them at auction the following week to settle the debt, and everyone assumed they would go to the renderer because there was no profit in a starving scrub flock in a year when good fat lambs would not fetch their feed cost. Nell went to that auction. She stood at the back of a knot of ranchers and townsmen on the loading dock behind the feed store, and she listened to them make sport of the animals in the pen, and when the auctioneer opened the lot and no man raised a hand, she raised hers, and she said $28, and the crowd turned to look at her as though a fence post had spoken. A man near her laughed outright. $28 for 65 sheep that would be dead by August. That worked out, someone said loudly for the pleasure of the crowd, to about 43 cents a head, and a body could buy a better dinner than that for the same coin. Nell did not turn to see who had said it. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer. And the auctioneer, who had a soft spot, or perhaps only a tired one, brought the hammer down and said sold to the woman at the back. It was there, at that auction, that she first laid eyes on Silas Renwick. He came to her afterward as she stood by the pen figuring how she would move 65 weak animals 4 miles uphill, and he was everything she was not. Broad and well-fed, and dressed in a town suit of good gray wool, with a gold watch chain and a voice as smooth as poured cream. He introduced himself as the land and stock agent for the Cordell Livestock Company, an outfit out of the capital that had spent the lean years buying up the bottomland ranches of 3 counties, consolidating water rights and grazing leases into one great holding, and he told her with a warmth that never once reached his eyes that she had made a hard bargain for herself, and he admired her spirit. Then he offered to take the whole lot off her hands for what she'd paid, $28 even, and call it a kindness, seeing as how a woman alone up on that dry bench had troubles enough without a starving flock to bury. She thanked him for his concern. She said she believed she would keep them. Something flickered behind the smooth face, a small readjustment, the look of a man revising a figure in a ledger, and then the warmth flowed back, and he touched his hat and said the offer would stand a while, that she should not be too proud to take a hand up. She walked home behind her sheep in the falling light, and did not think of him again for a long while, which was her first mistake, though not one that cost her. The first labor was the loneliest work she had ever known. She moved the flock up to the bench over 2 days, carrying the weakest lambs across her shoulders, and when she had them penned in what remained of the barn, she sat down on an overturned bucket in the dark and did her arithmetic again, and the arithmetic said she would not make it. $41 had become $13 after the sheep and the cart hire, and a sack of cracked corn, $13 against the winter. 65 animals that needed grass she did not have, on 90 acres of ground so overgrazed and drought-thinned that the previous owner had starved them nearly to death upon it. She would sit some nights with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper, and she would try to make the numbers come out alive, and they would not, and she would blow out the lamp to save the oil and lie in the dark, listening to the wind worry at the broken roof. The truth of a place like that, she was learning, is written in subtraction. Every day took something. Every day the grass grew thinner and the water hole lower and the fear a little heavier. She came near to despair in those first weeks, near enough that she wrote out, one bad night, a letter to Silas Renwick accepting his $28, and she would have mailed it the next morning but for what happened at first light. At first light she went out to the pen to find that one of the ewes, a bony, gray-faced thing she had already privately marked as unlikely to last the month, had lambed in the night, and there in the straw was a lamb on its feet, wet and wobbling, and alive, butting at its mother with a stubbornness that had no business existing in a creature born to nothing on a ruined farm in a dying year. Nell knelt in the straw and watched that lamb nurse. It was the smallest thing, and it changed nothing about the arithmetic, and it changed everything. She burned the letter to Renwick in the cook stove that morning and boiled her coffee over the ashes of it. If a starving ewe could find enough in herself to make new life out of picked-over ground, then Nell Ashby, who had 2 good hands, and no one depending on her but 66 mouths, now instead of 65, could find enough in herself to try one more season. She did not yet know how she would do it. She only knew that she would not sell to the man in the gray suit. Being alive, she thought, is its own argument, and a lamb standing on new legs was an argument she could not refuse. It was the old woman who showed her how. Her nearest neighbor on the bench, a mile off across a draw, was a widow named Kadja Vorland, who had come from the mountain country of the old world 60 years before as a girl, and had grazed sheep on hard ground her whole life, and buried a husband and 2 sons on it, and was regarded in the valley as either a witch or a saint, depending on who was doing the regarding and how their luck was running. Katja came walking one evening with a crock of curded cheese and a way of looking at things that made Nell feel, for the first time in that country, that she was being seen rather than measured. She did not laugh at the flock. She walked slowly through the pen with her hand out, letting the animals come to her, and she said in her soft accent that rounded every hard word, that these were good sheep, old-blood sheep, the kind her people had run in the high, stony pastures where the fine, soft breeds would sicken and die. You are trying to feed them, Katja said. That is your trouble. On this ground, you must not feed them. You must let them find And when Nell said there was nothing on the ground to find, that it was grazed to the dirt, Katja shook her head and said the ground was not empty, only tired, and that a tired thing is not a dead thing. The land remembers what the farmer forgets, she said, but it will not shout the answer to you. It whispers always. So, you must learn to be quiet enough to hear. The practical key Katja gave her was this: stop keeping the flock in one place. The previous owner had failed because he had penned his animals on the near pasture and let them eat it to ruin while the far reaches of the 90 acres went untouched and the deep-rooted plants that survive a drought were never grazed at all. Katja taught her to move them. A little every day, a slow tide of animals across the whole of the ground, never letting them linger long enough to kill what they ate, always leaving the roots to hold and heal. It was the oldest knowledge there was, the way her people had grazed the high pastures for 1,000 years, and it was precisely the opposite of everything the big scientific outfits in the bottomland did, with their fenced lots and their bought feed. Nell listened. She was, above all things, a woman who could be quiet enough to hear. And she began the next morning to move her sheep. The boy came to her that summer too, and stayed. His name was Wesley Tuck, and he was 10 years old, the middle child of the Tucks who worked a shares farm down at the foot of the bench and had more children than acres. He was a silent, watchful child, the kind that grown people forget is in the room, and he began appearing at the fence line to watch the sheep, and then to help move them, and then simply to be there day after day, saying almost nothing. He was the only person in the valley who did not think Nell Ashby was a fool. He gave the sheep names, which she had refused to let herself do, and once he had named them, she could not unname them. There was a ewe he called Biscuit, and a black-faced one he called Judge, and above all there was the ram, a great old scarred creature with a Roman nose and a slow, steady eye, whom Wesley named Governor, and treated with the solemn respect the animal seemed to expect as his due. Governor had a calm in him that spread through the whole flock, a settledness, and Nell came to trust his sense of the ground more than her own. Where Governor led, the water and the good forage were near. She did not question it. Wesley did not question it either. The two of them, the woman alone and the silent boy, moved the flock across the healing land through the long, hot summer, and the town below did not know they were alive, and that suited both of them fine. By the end of that first summer, the ground had begun to change in ways only Nell and Wesley and old Katja could see. Where the sheep had passed and moved on, the deep grasses came back thicker, and their sharp, small hooves broke the crust of the baked soil, so the rain, when it came at all, sank in instead of running off. The manure they left fed the ground. The flock that everyone had sentenced to die had, by simply being allowed to do what its nature intended, begun to bring the ruined bench back toward life. And the sheep themselves had filled out, their ribs vanishing under fleece, their eyes gone bright. But the true change, the thing Nell banked like a coal kept low and red under a bed of gray ash, came in the autumn, when she and Wesley, following Governor's stubborn insistence, cleared the brush from a rocky fold in the far northeast corner of the 90 acres, a place the previous owner had fenced off as useless, and found beneath a slab of overhanging stone a seep of water coming cold and steady out of the hillside, a spring that ran a thin, bright thread down into a hollow the animals had already found and worn smooth. Katja came and looked at it a long time. "This is old water," she said finally. "Deep water. It does not come from the sky, so the sky cannot take it away." And Nell understood, standing there with the cold water running over her fingers, that she had bought for $28 something, the whole valley would one day die for the want of, and she said nothing about it to anyone, and neither did the boy, and neither did the old woman, because some things you keep low under the ash until the night you need the fire. The first vindication came from outside, as such things do, in the person of a wool buyer named Aldous Pruitt, who came up from the rail junction in the second spring in 1933, working the back country for the coarse hardy fleeces that the carpet mills back east prized, and that no one in that valley of fine wool men bothered to raise. He came to Nell's bench because someone at the feed store had told him, laughing, that a fool woman up top had a flock of scrub sheep, and he came expecting to waste an afternoon, and he stayed to run the wool through his fingers with the still concentration of a man who has found something he did not expect to find. "This is good clip," he said. "This is long staple mountain wool, strong as wire and clean, and I have not seen its like in this country." He paid her more per pound than the bottomland men got for their soft, fine wool that the mills no longer wanted, and he paid it in cash. And he told her he would take every pound she could shear for the next 10 years. What if that sale went down the mountain the way water goes down a mountain, finding every crack? The men who had laughed at 43 cents a head did the new arithmetic and did not laugh as easily. And Silas Renwick, who kept a ledger on everything in 3 counties, made a note. The drought came in 1934, like the open door of a furnace. It had been building 2 dry years, but that 3rd summer it arrived complete, a heat that stood over the valley and did not move, a sky scoured white and empty from horizon to horizon, day upon day upon day, with no cloud in it. The bottomland creeks that had watered the great Cordell holdings and the small farms alike went first to a trickle, and then to cracked mud, and then to nothing. The wells failed one after another down the valley, the shallow dug wells of the farms, and then the deeper wells of the ranches, the water table dropping away beneath them all like a tide going out and not coming back. The fine wool flocks in their fenced lots, dependent on hauled feed and creek water, began to die, and the scientific grazing of the great outfits, all fences and bought hay, and no deep old knowledge in it, proved to be a house built on the sand of a wet year. Cattle went down into bottomland dust. Men who had laughed on a loading dock 2 summers past now watched their stock die of thirst within sight of dry creek beds, and did their own terrible arithmetic, and came up, every one of them, short. But up on the bench, in the northeast corner, behind a fold of rock, a spring of old deep water that the sky had never given, and so the sky could not take away, ran on, cold and steady, exactly as it had run when Governor first led them to it. Nell's healed ground held its moisture in the deep roots. The moving flock had spared and fed, and where the bottomland was baked to brick, her pastures kept a stubborn dun-colored life. Her 65 sheep, grown now with 2 years of lambs to more than 140 head, were fat and watered, while the valley's fine flocks perished. She had, without meaning to, without planning it, become the only person for 15 miles in any direction with living water and living grass. And the news of it, like the news of the wool, went down the mountain and found every crack. Silas Renwick came up the mountain first, before the others, because a predator moves before the herd. He came in a fine motor car that struggled on the bench road, and he climbed out, dusting his gray suit, and the warmth was still there in his voice, but there was something underneath it now, a hunger poorly hidden. He praised her spring. He praised her flock, and then he laid out his proposal, which had grown a great deal since the day he had offered her $28. The Cordell Livestock Company, he said, wished to purchase her entire holding, the 90 acres and the spring and the flock, for the handsome sum of $1,100 cash money, in a year when cash was worth 10 times its weight. He watched her face for the leap of greed, and did not find it. When she declined, he named $1,400. When she declined again, the warmth thinned like ice over moving water, and he spoke of how a spring like hers, in a drought like this, would draw desperate men, and how a woman alone on a remote bench might find herself unable to protect what was hers, and how the company had the men and the lawyers and the standing, and she did not. It was not quite a threat. It was shaped exactly like concern, the way his first offer had been shaped like charity, and Nell heard in it the truth of the man at last. She told him her land was not for sale. He got back in his car. He said she would regret her pride. Being right, she thought, watching the dust of his going, is its own kind of reply, and she did not need to make another. Then Renwick set about getting by scheme what he could not get by purchase. He went down into the valley, and he worked the desperation of it like a man working dough. He spread word that the woman on the bench was hoarding water while the valley's children went thirsty, that a spring on private land in a public emergency ought by rights to be managed by a responsible company for the good of all, that she was too small and too alone, and too strange to be trusted with something so vital. He filed a petition with the county to have her water declared a shared resource under some clause of the emergency, and he let it be known that the Cordell Company stood ready to buy and administer the spring fairly for everyone, and he set a meeting at the town hall for the whole valley to decide the matter. And he arranged it so cleverly that by the time the day came, half the parched and frightened valley believed that Nell Ashby was the villain of the drought and Silas Renwick its savior. He miscalculated only one thing, and it was the thing his kind always miscalculates. He had learned to count everything except the worth of a decent act. The one who came to her before the meeting in shame was Harmon Yell. Harmon Yell was the man who had laughed loudest on the loading dock 2 summers before, the man who had said 43 cents a head could buy a better dinner, a big boasting bottomland rancher who had run 400 fine wool sheep and thought himself the measure of the valley. The drought had ruined him worst of all, for he had borrowed against his flock to buy more, and now his flock was dying and his notes were due, and the Cordell Company held the paper and would have his ground for pennies within the month. He came up the bench road on foot, his good boots white with dust, and he stood at Nell's fence and could not at first make himself speak, and when he did, his voice broke on it. He had children, he said. He had a well gone dry and stock dying, and he had no right to ask her anything. He knew that. He remembered what he had said, and he had come to ask if she would sell him water, and that he could not pay for it. Not now, maybe not ever. Nell looked at the ruined, boastful man a long moment. She said he could water his stock at her spring, that Wesley would show him the way, and that there would be no charge. Harmon Yell wept then, a big man weeping at a fence in the terrible heat, and he said he did not understand her, and she said there was nothing to understand, that a tired thing was not a dead thing, and that no one in this valley was going to die of thirst within a mile of good water while she had a say in it. The meeting hall was full to the walls on the white-hot afternoon this story began. Silas Renwick had the front of the room, and he had done his work well, and the fear and thirst in that room had a shape now, and the shape was a woman alone, on a bench, who would not share. He rose in his gray suit, and he spoke with all his poured cream warmth about the emergency and the public good and the responsible administration of a vital resource, and he laid out the Cordell Company's generous offer to purchase and manage the spring for the benefit of all, and he spoke of the spring's remarkable flow. And here he made his one fatal error, the error of a man who counts too well. He said that the spring produced, by careful measure, some 900 gallons a day, more than enough for the whole valley if wisely managed. And in the hush that followed, Nell Ashby rose from her straight-backed chair and asked him in her plain quiet voice that carried in the stillness, how he had come by that figure of 900 gallons, that precise measured figure, given that she had never told a living soul what her spring produced, and given that her spring lay behind a locked gate in the farthest corner of 90 private acres. The room went very still. Renwick's smooth face worked. He had measured it himself, of course, or sent men to measure it, creeping onto her land in the dark to gauge the prize he meant to take, and the too precise number had given him away as surely as a footprint in mud. There was no clean answer, and every soul in that room watched him fail to find one. Then Nell Ashby spoke to the whole valley, and she did not raise her voice. She said the spring was hers, bought fair with a flock of sheep everyone in that room had laughed at, and that it was not for sale to the Cordell Company, nor to any company, not for $1,100, nor $1,400, nor any sum, because water like that was never rightly a thing to be owned and traded for profit in a year when people were dying for the want of it. But she said it was also not a thing to be hoarded. Any family in the valley that needed water for their household and their stock could come and take it from her, spring, freely, for as long as the drought lasted. She would ask no money for the water itself, for the water was not hers to sell. It was old and deep, and it had been in that ground long before she came, and would be there long after. She would ask only that those able to work give a day, now and again, to help lay a pipe down off the bench, so the sick and the old need not climb for it. And that would be payment, not for the gift, but for the labor, which was a fair thing to ask. And she sat down. The tide of that room turned in a single instant, the way a tide does, all at once after seeming for a long while never to move at all. The men who had laughed on the loading dock stood up one after another and took off their hats. Harmoniel was the first to speak, and he told them all what she had done for him already, before this meeting, before there was any credit to be had for it. And the room that had come to condemn a woman alone rose, instead, to honor her. And Silas Renwick stood at the front of it in his fine gray suit and felt his power run out through the floor, like water into sand, for you cannot buy a valley that has just remembered its own decency. He gathered his papers. He said something about the petition, about the county, and no one was listening. And he walked out through the door with the loud bell, and the Cordell Company's designs on Cedar Hollow went out the door with him and did not come back. He had counted everything and understood nothing. The rains came in the last week of that August, the way they will after they have taught their lesson, a slow gray front rolling up out of the south and breaking over the valley in a downpour that men and women stood out in the open to feel, turning their faces up to it, and laughing and weeping. The creeks ran again. The wells took slowly back their water. The land, which remembers, began to heal. And the deep old spring in the northeast corner ran on exactly as before, unbothered, for it had never known there was a drought at all. They laid the pipe that autumn, a good half-mile of it down off the bench, and it was Cedar Hollow's own hands that laid it, and it stood as a thing the valley had built together in a hard year. And it stands yet. Nell Ashby was no longer the fool on the bench, no longer the woman alone. She was the one who had held the water and given it. Her flock came through the drought hole and grew, and Aldous Brewitt bought her long strong wool every spring for years. And Wesley Tuck grew up working that land beside her and inherited it in time, which is another story. Old Katja Forland walked over one evening, late that autumn, when the grass was greening on the healed bench and the lambs of a new season were dropping in the fold. She stood beside Nell at the fence and looked out at Governor moving slow and dignified among his ewes, and at the far corner where the spring ran bright, and she said what she had said the first evening she came, that the land remembers what the farmer forgets, and that it whispers the answer and will never shout it. So a person must only be quiet enough and humble enough to hear. And Nell Ashby, who had come to that valley with $41 and bought 65 starving sheep for 28 of them, and been laughed at from one end of the county to the other, stood in the cool of the evening on ground that was hers and belonged to her people now. And she was quiet,